The two-story house belonging to the Thompson family in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, appeared at first glance to be a typical middle-class home. However, once you stepped through the front door, there was a subtle but unmistakable tension hanging in the air. Rachel Thompson lived in her childhood home with her 8-year-old daughter Sophia. 3 years had passed since her divorce, and the harsh reality was that her part-time office job alone wasn't enough to support independent living. Her father Robert and mother Margaret were devoted churchgoers and were known in the neighborhood as an exemplary couple. "Welcome home, Rachel," Margaret called from the kitchen, but her voice carried more of a sense of duty than maternal love. "Where's Sophia?" "She went upstairs to do her homework," Rachel replied with a tired expression, setting her handbag on a chair. Even though it was only part-time work, standing all day made her feet ache. Just then, the front door burst open. "I'm home," came a cheerful voice as her sister Jessica entered, holding the hand of her 7-year-old son Ryan. Jessica worked full-time at the local bank and was her parents' pride and joy. "Jessie." Margaret's voice instantly transformed, becoming warm and full of affection. "Ryan, come to Grandma." Ryan flew into his grandmother's arms. Margaret hugged her grandson tightly, covering his cheek with kisses. "How was school today? Did your teacher praise you?" "Yes. I got 100 on my math test." "That's wonderful. Grandma has a special treat ready for you." Rachel watched this scene in silence. When Sophia brought home good test scores, her mother's reaction was always, "Well, that's expected." And when Sophia made any mistakes, she was invariably met with, "You're just like your mother, hopeless." In the living room, Robert was reading the newspaper while watching television. When Jessica greeted him, he looked up from his paper and smiled. "Jessie, another hard day at work." "Ryan, have you finished your homework already?" "Yes, Grandpa." Ryan answered energetically. "Good boy. You're truly our family genius," Robert said, gently patting his grandson's head. When Rachel tried to praise Sophia in the same way, her father would always coldly respond with, "Don't let her get a big head." 8-year-old Sophia didn't fully understand the difference in her grandparents' attitudes yet, but sometimes she showed a confused expression. "Rachel, you sit down too," Margaret called from the kitchen. However, her tone was clearly different from how she spoke to Jessica. "How much did you earn today? Don't forget to contribute to the household expenses." "I know, Mother," Rachel sighed. Every month, she contributed most of her part-time wages to the household budget, but her mother continued to tell her, "Work more," and "Stop being lazy." Meanwhile, despite Jessica's full-time salary, their parents gently advised her to save for your future, and her contribution to household expenses was minimal. All of Ryan's school supplies and extracurricular activity costs were happily covered by his grandparents. When evening came, the whole family gathered around the dining table. The dinner Margaret had prepared was lavish as usual. However, there was a subtle but clear difference in how the food was served. Jessica and Ryan received generous portions of hot, delicious food, as did Robert. Rachel and Sophia's portions were always slightly cold and more modest in size. "Ryan, eat more. You're in your growing years," Margaret said, adding more food to her grandson's plate. "Sophia, don't leave any food. It's wasteful, so eat everything," the same grandmother said to Sophia, but her tone was stern. The dinner conversation always centered around Jessica and Ryan. Ryan's school activities, Jessica's work successes, future plans, everything was painted in bright, cheerful topics. When Rachel tried to contribute to the conversation, she was often interrupted with the "speaking of which," and the subject would be changed. Sophia sometimes continued eating quietly, puzzled by the different treatment she and Ryan received. For an 8-year-old girl, it would take time to understand her position in this house. However, for her mother Rachel, everything was painfully clear. The next morning, Rachel woke at 6:30 and began preparing Sophia for school. Margaret was already in the kitchen preparing breakfast, but the scene repeated the same pattern as the previous night's dinner. On the counter sat 2 different breakfasts. One consisted of fresh pancakes with berries and maple syrup, scrambled eggs, and orange juice. The other was cold cereal with milk and leftover toast from the day before. "Good morning, Ryan." Margaret beamed at her grandson coming down the stairs. "Grandma made special pancakes for you. Your favorite with blueberries." Ryan's eyes lit up as he sat at the table. "Wow, thank you, Grandma." A few minutes later, Sophia came downstairs. "Good morning, Grandma." "Good morning. Your breakfast is over there, so hurry up and eat. You'll be late for school." Margaret's voice was businesslike, without a trace of the warmth she'd shown moments before. Sophia sat in front of the cold cereal, looking with confusion at Ryan's elaborate breakfast. "Grandma, can I have some pancakes too?" "No. Cereal is plenty for you. If you get used to luxury, you'll become a worthless adult," Margaret answered without turning around. Rachel clenched her teeth. "Mother, you have the ingredients, don't you? Couldn't you share a little with Sophia?" "Ingredients cost money." "Rachel, if you earned more, you could say things like that," Margaret replied coldly. "Besides, you shouldn't spoil children. Looking at you, that's obvious enough." Robert called from the living room. "What are you all fussing about? If you have complaints, make it yourself." Rachel silently gripped her coffee cup. Sophia said in a small voice, "It's okay, Mama." Cereal is fine, but tears welled up in her eyes. The disparity continued even during school preparations. Ryan's new lunchbox was carefully packed with homemade sandwiches, fruit, and his favorite cookies. Sophia, on the other hand, was given only lunch money and told to make do with school lunch. "But Grandma, today is our field trip, so everyone's bringing lunch," Sophia said in a small voice. "Then get something from the cafeteria. If you explain the situation to your teacher, she'll understand," Margaret dismissed her. Rachel hurried to the kitchen and quickly made a simple lunch from leftovers. However, with limited time, it looked rather pitiful. Sophia still accepted it with a smile, saying, "Thank you, Mama." That afternoon, when Rachel returned from work, a different scene was unfolding in the living room. Robert was playing a new game with Ryan. "Grandpa, this is fun." Ryan was excited. "Right? Next weekend, let's go buy even newer games," Robert said, patting his grandson's head. Sophia was sitting in a corner reading an old book. It was one she'd borrowed from the library and had already read several times. "Sophia, have you finished your homework?" Rachel asked. "Yes. But I'd like a math workbook. My teacher mentioned it." "A workbook?" Margaret interjected. "You can borrow one from the library. Always wanting things that cost money." "But you bought Ryan a new game, didn't you?" Rachel protested. "Ryan gets good grades and has a promising future. He's worth the investment," Robert said, looking up from his newspaper. "Sophia is, well, ordinary." Sophia's face clouded over. In reality, her grades were the same as Ryan's or better, but her grandparents never acknowledged this. The decisive moment came on Sophia's 8th birthday. That morning, Rachel woke her daughter and hugged her, saying, "Happy birthday." However, downstairs, the ordinary morning began as if no one remembered it was her birthday. "Today is Sophia's birthday," Rachel announced to the family at dinner. "Oh, that's right," Margaret replied indifferently. "Happy birthday, Sophia." "Thank you, Grandma," Sophia replied quietly. But that was all. No special meal, no cake, no presents. In contrast, Ryan's birthday 2 months earlier had featured a big cake, lots of presents, and a celebration with the whole family. Remembering that made Rachel's chest tighten. That night, after Sophia had gone to sleep, Rachel cried in her room. Her daughter's disappointed expression, and her brave attempt to say she was okay, these images wouldn't leave her mind. The next day was Rachel's payday. Her mother naturally held out her hand, asking, "How much this month?" It's a little less this month. I had to buy shoes for Sophia, Rachel explained. Sophia's shoes had become too small, and her toes looked painful. Excuses again. Children's shoes don't need to be expensive, Margaret said irritably. Think about your contribution to the household first. That same day, Margaret bought Ryan 2 pairs of new sneakers. They were expensive brand-name shoes, costing 10 times more than Sophia's shoes. Ryan plays sports, so he needs good shoes, Margaret explained matter-of-factly. However, no one remembered that Sophia also participated in the sports club at school. That night, Rachel gazed at her sleeping daughter's face and thought about what kind of scars this situation would leave on Sophia's heart if it continued. The 8-year-old girl was beginning to understand why she alone received different treatment. Watching her confusion and sadness was more painful than anything for Rachel. Friday evening, the Thompson family dining room was set for dinner. Margaret had been enthusiastically cooking since morning because Jessica and Ryan were joining them for dinner. The table was laden with lavish dishes. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and the aroma of freshly baked bread filled the house. Margaret proudly surveyed her culinary skills while putting the finishing touches on the meal. Today is a special day, so let's all have a delicious dinner together. Margaret was in high spirits. She had just received news that Jessica had been offered a promotion. Rachel was washing dishes in the kitchen, watching her mother's behavior. Sophia had finished her homework and was looking at the dining table with anticipation. Seeing the elaborate spread, she thought that perhaps today they too might get to eat the same food. At 6 o'clock, Jessica and Ryan arrived. I'm home. Jessica's voice was buoyant. Did you hear about the promotion news? Of course. Margaret hugged her daughter. My pride and joy. I made a special dinner to celebrate. Robert also came out of the living room and congratulated Jessica. Wonderful news. You're the pride of our family. Ryan, Grandma made your favorite roast beef today, Robert said, patting his grandson's shoulder.
Yay!
Ryan clapped his hands in delight. When the whole family sat at the table, Margaret began serving the food. However, watching how she served it made Rachel's heart nearly stop. Jessica's plate was beautifully arranged with 3 thick slices of roast beef, plenty of mashed potatoes, and colorful vegetables. Ryan received similarly generous portions, with meat gently cut to suit a child's preferences and lots of side dishes. Robert's plate was equally lavish. What was placed in front of Rachel and Sophia were last night's leftovers. Cold spaghetti and stale bread crusts. That was all. Mother, Rachel said in a trembling voice. What about our portions? Oh, your portions are right there, Margaret replied as if it were obvious. It would be wasteful to throw away yesterday's leftovers, so eat those. Sophia stared at her plate, then looked back and forth between it and the family's elaborate meals. Confusion and sadness filled the 8-year-old girl's eyes. But Grandma, this is cold, Sophia said in a small voice. It would be wasteful not to eat it, Margaret said coldly. Don't be demanding. Robert also glared at his daughter. Don't complain. Be grateful for food. Sophia tried to pick up her chopsticks with trembling hands to eat the cold spaghetti. However, her hands shook so much she could barely bring the food to her mouth. Here, Ryan, eat more, Margaret added more food to her grandson's plate. You're growing, so you need to eat lots. Thank you, Grandma. It's so delicious. Ryan replied with a smile. Sophia tried to lift her chopsticks again, but the trembling wouldn't stop. Faced with the cold leftovers, tears rolled down her cheeks. Sophia, are you crying? Jessica noticed and said. However, her voice carried contempt rather than sympathy. You should be grateful just to have food. That's right, Margaret agreed. She cries over things like this because she's been spoiled. Rachel, this is because of your poor parenting. Rachel stared at her daughter's trembling hands, feeling something inside her heart break with an audible crack. An 8-year-old child was being forced to eat cold leftovers alone at a family meal. And instead of showing sympathy for this situation, the family blamed her daughter. "Sophia, eat a little more," Robert commanded. "Don't leave the table until you've finished everything." Sophia wiped her tears and picked up her chopsticks again. However, the trembling wouldn't stop, and she couldn't properly grasp the spaghetti. "Honestly, how clumsy," Margaret sighed. "You'll never be able to do anything in the future like that." At that moment, Rachel quietly took out her smartphone. None of the family noticed. Everyone was either focused on their own warm meals or busy criticizing Sophia. Rachel quickly typed a message, "Please come now. It's time for our appointment. I want you to see my granddaughter's situation." Then she pressed send. "Ryan, we have dessert too," Margaret smiled at her grandson. "I made your favorite chocolate cake." "Really?" Ryan's eyes sparkled. "Of course. It's a celebration of the promotion, so today is special." Sophia was still struggling with the cold spaghetti. The food was completely cold now, and the sauce had congealed. However, under her grandparents' stern gaze, she had no choice but to continue eating. "Rachel, say something," Margaret looked at her daughter. "Your child is playing with her food." "She's not playing with her food," Rachel replied in a low voice. "It's just cold and hard to eat." "Excuses again," Robert looked up from his newspaper. "This is what happens when you spoil them." "That's right," Jessica agreed. "When I was a child, I ate whatever was served without complaining. Today's children have no patience." However, Rachel painfully remembered that when Jessica was a child, she had been given the same special treatment that Ryan received now. Sophia said "I'm sorry" in a small voice and picked up her chopsticks again with trembling hands. Watching this, Rachel's heart felt ready to burst. "Here, Ryan, eat more." Margaret piled even more food on her grandson's plate. "Today is a special day, so you can eat as much as you want." Meanwhile, Sophia still had more than half of her cold spaghetti left. To the 8-year-old girl, it looked as large as a mountain. "Hurry up and eat," Robert urged. "Everyone is waiting." Sophia continued eating desperately while holding back tears. Watching her brave figure, Rachel clenched her fists. She had reached her limit. Rachel looked at her watch. 25 minutes had passed since she sent the message. It should be about time now. "Shall I serve dessert?" Margaret stood up. "I'll cut special cake for Ryan and Jessica." "What about our portions?" Rachel asked. "You two need to finish those leftovers first. Dessert comes after that." Sophia looked at the remaining cold spaghetti with a despairing expression. As she tried to pick up her chopsticks again, her hands were trembling violently. Then the doorbell rang. Everyone stopped and looked toward the entrance. Who could that be at this hour? Margaret frowned. "Rachel, go answer it." "I'll get it." Rachel stood up. Her heart was pounding violently, but her expression remained calm. When she opened the front door, an elegant elderly couple stood there. The man was using a cane, and the woman held a small handbag. Both appeared to be over 80, but their eyes held strong determination. "Grandpa Edward, Grandma Eleanor," Rachel greeted them with relief. They were Margaret's parents, Sophia's great-grandparents. They lived in the neighboring town and only visited every few months. However, Rachel had been secretly keeping in touch with them. "Rachel, you must be tired," Eleanor said in a gentle voice. "How is Sophia doing?" "She's fine, but today has been particularly difficult," Rachel replied, turning back. Confused voices could be heard from the dining room. "Dad? Mom?" Margaret's surprised voice echoed. "Why so suddenly?" Edward and Eleanor slowly entered the dining room. The moment they saw the situation at the table, their expressions changed completely. Jessica and Ryan surrounded by lavish food, and Robert as well. Meanwhile, Sophia sat with trembling chopsticks in front of cold leftovers. Tear tracks were still visible on the 8-year-old girl's cheeks, and the trembling hadn't stopped. What is the meaning of this? Edward's voice was low and filled with anger. Oh, Dad, Mom, welcome. Margaret hurriedly stood up. What brings you here so suddenly? If you'd called, I would have prepared a meal. I'd like an explanation. Eleanor looked around at her sons. Why is Sophia eating different food from everyone else? Huh? Margaret was confused. This is just because the leftovers would be wasteful. Wasteful? Edward struck his cane on the floor. While others eat warm meals, you make an 8-year-old child eat cold leftovers because it's wasteful? Robert interjected. This is our household policy. We mustn't spoil children. Eleanor gasped. Are you saying you're not spoiling Ryan? Looking at Ryan's plate, there was plenty of roast beef and vegetables, plus the chocolate cake that was about to be served. Ryan is having a special day, Jessica defended. It's celebrating my promotion. Doesn't Sophia have special days? Edward's voice became even sterner. What about this child's birthday? Silence fell. No one could answer. Last month on Sophia's birthday, what did you do? Eleanor pressed. Well, we were busy, Margaret stammered. Busy? Edward was furious. Didn't you throw a big party for Ryan's birthday? Rachel showed me the photos. Margaret and Robert looked at each other. They hadn't known that Rachel had been in contact with her grandparents. Grandpa, Grandma, Sophia said in a small voice. I'm okay. This food is delicious too. Eleanor knelt down in front of her great-granddaughter. Sophia, you're not okay. This is wrong. But Grandma said I shouldn't be demanding. Demanding? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Is asking for a warm meal being demanding? Edward looked around the table. Is this how we treat our granddaughter? Is this what family means? Dad, you're misunderstanding, Margaret desperately defended herself. We're doing this with love. Love? Edward stood up. Is this love? This is discrimination and abuse. Abuse? That's such an exaggeration, Robert protested. Exaggeration? Eleanor stood up. Making an 8-year-old eat cold leftovers while giving other children lavish meals. What else would you call this but abuse? We're doing the right thing, Margaret started to say when Edward raised his hand to stop her. Enough, Edward's voice was ice cold. Margaret, Robert, and Jessica. Listen carefully. The three of them shrank back. I have seen with my own eyes how an 8-year-old girl of our bloodline is being treated in this house, Edward struck his cane on the floor. This is not what human beings do. Dad, but, Margaret tried to speak. Silence. Edward's angry voice rang out. You are discriminating against and abusing your granddaughter. And you're trying to justify it. Eleanor took Sophia's hand. Sophia, from today you'll live with us. Rachel too. Huh? Sophia's eyes widened. Mom, that's Margaret panicked. Edward stared at his daughter. I'm removing you from my will. Robert and Jessica too. What are you saying, Dad? Margaret turned pale. My wealth should be inherited by those who cherish family with love, Edward declared. I won't give a penny to people like you. Dad, you're joking, right? Jessica also panicked. Joking? Eleanor replied coldly. Is abusing an 8-year-old child a joke? We didn't mean it that way, Robert defended. Intentions don't matter, Edward struck his cane. Results are everything. Anyone can see how hurt Sophia is. Sophia finally began crying aloud at her great-grandparents' kind words. The sadness and loneliness she had been enduring burst forth all at once. Sophia, it's all right now, Eleanor embraced her great-granddaughter. We'll protect you. Rachel, Edward looked at his granddaughter. Pack your things. Starting tonight, you'll live in our house. But Dad, Margaret pleaded tearfully. We're family, aren't we? Family? Edward turned back. You've forgotten the meaning of family. Family means cherishing each other, loving one another. Not discrimination and abuse. Please reconsider the inheritance, Robert begged. Reconsider? Eleanor laughed coldly. Have you ever reconsidered your attitude toward your 8-year-old granddaughter? Margaret, Robert, and Jessica were speechless at this sudden turn of events. They had been counting on the grandparents' inheritance for their financial planning. Ryan, Eleanor turned to her grandson. You're not at fault. But you mustn't learn from the adults' mistakes. Ryan looked at his cousin Sophia with a confused expression for the first time. Seeing her tears and trembling hands, he began to understand that something had been wrong. Come, Rachel, Sophia, Edward turned to them. Let's start a new life. 6 months had passed since then. Edward and Eleanor's house in the neighboring town had become a true home for Sophia. Waking each morning to the aroma of warm pancakes, being greeted with loving voices saying good morning, this was the affection an 8-year-old girl should naturally receive. Sophia, how was school today? Eleanor welcomed her great-granddaughter home with a smile. It was wonderful. I won an award in the art contest. Sophia showed her certificate with shining eyes. That's wonderful. Eleanor hugged her great-granddaughter. Tonight let's celebrate by making your favorite cake. Rachel had started a new job. Through Edward's introduction, she began working as a full-time employee at a well-known local interior design company. Her talents were properly valued, and she was already being assigned several projects. Welcome home, Rachel, Edward greeted his granddaughter's return. How did today's presentation go? Thanks to you, I was able to secure a big contract, Rachel smiled with satisfaction. I want to work hard for you two who have helped us so much. Not for us, Edward said gently. For you and Sophia. That's what family means. Meanwhile, serious circumstances continued at the Thompson house. Edward's exclusion from the inheritance had become reality, and their future plans were completely derailed. Margaret and Robert had to drastically revise their retirement fund plans. Despite Jessica's promotion, the housing loans and lifestyle planning that had counted on her grandparents' wealth collapsed, plunging her into financial hardship. How did things turn out this way? Margaret muttered, staring at the empty dining table. Since Rachel and Sophia left, the house had been enveloped in silence. If only we had been a little kinder then, Robert also regretted. However, this was regret over lost wealth, not regret born from love for Sophia. Jessica had left her parents' home and moved to a small apartment. Ryan sometimes asked, is cousin Sophia doing well? Through that night's events, even at 7 years old, he was beginning to understand something. A few months later, Eleanor happened to encounter Margaret in town. Margaret was clearly haggard, having lost her former dignity. Mom, Margaret said tearfully. Are Sophia and Rachel doing well? They're doing very well, Eleanor replied calmly. They're living surrounded by love. We also had love, Margaret started to say when Eleanor raised her hand to stop her. Love? What you showed was discrimination and abuse. Didn't you understand how hurtful that was for an 8-year-old child? Margaret couldn't say anything. But it's not too late even now, Eleanor continued. If you truly reflect and learn real love again, perhaps someday your granddaughters will forgive you. However, it must come from pure affection, not thoughts of inheritance. That night, Sophia asked her great-grandmother, Grandma, did my other grandparents hate me? Eleanor sat her great-granddaughter on her lap. I don't think they hated you. They just expressed their love in the wrong way. What is love? It's truly wishing for your happiness. Being sad with you when you're sad, and rejoicing with you when you're happy. And never discriminating against you by comparing you to anyone else. Sophia nodded quietly. Now I'm living in real love, aren't I? That's right, Eleanor hugged her great-granddaughter. You are a precious being who deserves to be loved. Rachel looked out the window, thinking. That decision had been right. From the night she stood up to protect her daughter, their lives had truly begun. True family love isn't just about blood relations. It's about cherishing, respecting, and supporting each other. Only when that exists can it truly be called family. This was what Rachel and Sophia had learned. And far away at the Thompson house, 3 adults spent lonely nights, finally beginning to realize the magnitude of what they had lost.